Okay. And I am going to turn it over to you, Julie. And hopefully the mic is on the laptop. So as long as you kind of face the laptop, you should get pretty clear.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Evolution Sunday. This is our 16th annual Evolution Sunday that we are having today. First of all, I want to apologize to you for last week for the technical difficulties. Those were entirely my fault. I have a new computer since last year when I did this presentation, and I was saving things in the wrong places. So I am so sorry about that. But hopefully all the images are coming through now, and you're able to see what we'll be talking about today. As you can see from all of the images that are there now, this is International Darwin Day. International Darwin Day. This concept started actually about a little over 100 years ago in an effort to celebrate Darwin's work because his scientific contributions just continue to be supported. And
Go ahead. I'm just going to keep an eye on the.
And all of the additional evidence that has come in to support evolution so far has supported it 100%, especially the genetics. We are doing so much with genetics, with the genes, and all of that, again, supports the concept of evolution, which if you weren't here last week, you remember evolution is simply change. It means that you're looking at what has happened over time, over millions of years on our planet to result in who we are today, to result in our being here. And I'm going to show you some things today and next week and the following week that I think will absolutely blow your mind. It has blown mine. I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we get to the mind-blowing part. But what we're talking about today is going to be plant evolution and communication. Yes, I said communication, because we'll be looking at how plants relate to each other. And they do in many, many ways that just you would not expect. At least I never expected, and I'm a biologist. So I have learned a lot from this presentation, and I hope you do too. And please, if you do have questions as we go, please do come in. All right. So as I said, the main topic for this year is going to be plant evolution and communication. As I also said, I'm a trained zoologist. So for me, getting into the plants has been something that I've done a little of, but not as much as I have with the animals. So it has been a learning experience for me too. And when we talk about organisms on the planet, we group them. Biologists are like that. We like things categorized. And when we look at the kingdom of Plantae, we're talking about plants that basically dominate all the terrestrial communities, from forests to deserts to agricultural land. They're everywhere. All you have to do is look around and you see plants. Plus, they provide most of our food. Think about what you eat, all the vegetables you eat, the medicine, and we'll talk about some of those, shelter, clothing. So much of what we take for granted is provided to us by these plants. Now, the plants are multicellular eukaryotes. The multicellular is pretty self-explanatory. With a eukaryote, you're talking about an organism that basically has a number of cell membranes inside the cell, surrounding the nucleus, surrounding some of the organelles that are in that cell. That's unlike what you find with most of the bacteria, where you do not find those internal cellular membranes. Now, these particular cells, these eukaryotes, have chlorophyll. And that chlorophyll allows them to carry out photosynthesis by capturing energy from the sun, which produces oxygen, which is essential for respiration in living organisms. We wouldn't be here without the plants because they provide the oxygen that we breathe. Now, I'm also including in with the plants the kingdom fungi, simply because this is a kingdom that basically helped plants survive on land. And it is one that I'll be talking a great deal about in addition to the plants, because it is amazing, absolutely amazing what these organisms can do. Now, when I talk about a fungus, I don't want you to think about that black stuff growing in the corner of your shower, okay? Or basically that structure you see on the side of a tree. Yes, those are fungi. And as we'll see, these fungi are everywhere. They're everywhere, just like when we talked about the microbiome several years ago. And you learn that bacteria are everywhere, inside and outside your body, everywhere in the environment. And they basically help to keep our bodies safe, the bacteria. Well, the fungi also lend a hand in that in terms of what they do for us and for the planet. Now, these are very unusual organisms. They have very little in common with plants, other than the fact that they grow in the ground and they are multicellular. Their bodies consist of these slender filaments that are called hyphy. Now, in the top right diagram there, what you see is a fruiting body of a fungus, otherwise known as a mushroom to us. And the upper portion, the cap of the mushroom, is essentially a spore-producing structure. That's the reproductive structure of the mushroom or of the fungus. You see those white lines that run down through the stem of the mushroom or the fungus. Those represent the filaments that come down to the ground level, where they form a very complex root system called the mycelium. And that mycelium can extend in some species of organisms literally for miles. Now think about that. I was out going for a walk in the neighborhood when the weather was nice a few days ago, and I kept, every step I took, I thought, what's down there? What's under me? What's in that ground? And how far does it extend? Because these mycelia are just phenomenal in what they can do, as you will learn. Now, the fungi, as I said, are similar to plants in that they grow in the ground, they're stationary. But these filaments, these hyphae, are able to move outward. That's how the organism grows and becomes so extensive. They can't make their own food like plants do. So that means they're dependent on basically eating other organisms. And they've got some interesting ways of doing that, including throwing harpoons. I'm not kidding. They're basically everywhere. They're inside you, around you. They basically change the way that life has evolved over billions of years. Now, the fungi, one of the reasons they're so successful is that they eat everything. As you can see, they eat rocks. Breaking down those rocks helps to make soil. They digest pollutants. They nourish and kill plants as well as help plants, depending on what the plant is. They can survive being in outer space. They can induce visions. David, that one was for you. They produce food. They make medicines. They can manipulate animal behavior, and they can influence the composition of the Earth's atmosphere. Some are predatory, like the one you see in the picture there at the top of the screen. That's called an oyster fungus. And it secretes a substance that will anesthetize roundworms that are close by. They then consume the roundworm. Now, there are lots of these roundworms that are out there that the fungi hunt to eat. That is part of their food. The fungi produce and release this chemical to attract the nematodes closer. The nematodes also produce a chemical to regulate their development and attract mates. The fungi use these same chemicals to lure the prey. Notice how they're able to mimic the roundworm and use a similar chemical to bring in the roundworm closer. So what happens then is that the fungi can grow adhesive nets that will stick to the nematodes. Some of them actually have nooses, like you see in the bottom picture there, that they can use to snare the roundworms. Others use a toxic droplet to paralyze their prey so that one of the hyphae can enter their mouths and digest them from the inside out. That's pretty gross. But essentially, nobody said nature was nice. So that basically, some of them actually use what are known as gun cells that are spores that harpoon the worms and kill them. This is just a little of what some of these fungi can do. Now, it's not known how some species snare prey or trap prey or fire projectiles into these small animals on which they prey, nor do we know how they decide which method to use. Maybe, it's Tuesday, so I think I'll use a harpoon. Who knows how they basically determine this? They can be the most harmful pests of living plants and harvested food products in particular, because they secrete substances that make the plants unpalatable. Now, when they do that, what they're trying to do is essentially save themselves. The plants are trying to save themselves, because if the plant is now unpalatable, theoretically, the insects or the pests that are coming in to feed on them will leave. They will not eat that particular plant. Others make foods that we like and enjoy, other fungi, like the following: beer, cheese, wine. I've never heard of a beer called Fungi. If I had heard of one, I'm not sure I would have tasted it anyway, but apparently there are some out there. So as you can see, fungi do have a good side as well in terms of making things that we do enjoy. Now, some of the fungi, such as the honey fungus that you see in the pictures at the bottom of the screen there, are among the largest organisms in the world. A fungus, one of the largest organisms in the world. The record holder is in Oregon and weighs hundreds of tons, spans 10 square kilometers, and is between 2,000 and 8,000 years old. As I said, these are amazing structures. Some are just microscopic, like the yeast that we put in bread or to make alcoholic beverages. Now, early in their evolution, plants developed a special relationship with fungi, and that's been the key to their successful occupation of terrestrial habitats. Some fungi have a symbiotic relationship with plants that started 500 million years ago as plants left the water to colonize land. Now, when we talk about a symbiotic relationship, if you're not quite sure what that means, it's sort of one of those situations where you help me and I'll help you. Sort of like what Congress does, right? In terms of helping each other. You do something for the other individual that individual cannot do for themselves, or that you could do better and help them out. So, as I said, when the plants left the water 500 million years ago, because remember we talked about last time that the earliest of the plant-like organisms were the blue-green algae, which were aquatic, they were in the water. And as they grew and began to leave the water, they needed a root system. They needed some way to attach themselves to the soil. Today, and the fungi serve that purpose. The fungi help them in the early years to establish these root systems. Today, there's more than 90% of plants that depend on a fungal root system that links trees to shared networks called, and I didn't make this one up, the Wood Wide Web. Say that one 3 times fast. The Wood Wide Web. So essentially 90% of our plants depend on this system. And we thought we were clever with the internet. This has been happening for 500 million years. This early association gave rise to all recognizable life on land, the future of which depends on the continued ability of plants and fungi to form healthy relationships. Now, if you just look at a couple of trees here, and you notice the extensive root systems. Let's see, I don't have a pointer on this, do I? No. Okay, all right. If you notice the extensive root system of the trees there, with the one on the left in gray, the one on the right in brown, you notice how they come down and they interdigitate. They join in with the fungi, which represent the white structures that look like spider webs down in the ground. Well, what the trees provide to the fungus is sugar and carbon. The sugar is a nutrient that the fungus uses, and that is a major food source for the fungus, and the carbon. The fungus, in turn, provides the trees with additional nutrients that the trees can't make themselves, and water, especially water, becomes very critical in this type of symbiotic relationship. At the bottom, you can see just a typical chunk of soil there with a plant on it, and notice the fungi coming out all around under the ground. Now, about 400 million years ago, in the Devonian period, known as the Age of Fishes, actually, some of the earliest fungi were taller than a 2-story building. Think about that. Taller than a 2-story building. That's bigger than that little mushroom you had for dinner last night. They were present for 40 million years. 40 million years they persisted. And that is because the early plants were beginning to form under them. And in those days, when the volcanic islands were made, and later as the glaciers retreated to reveal the bare rocks, the first organisms that appeared on land were fungi, bacteria, and algae that made the soil for the plants to grow and develop in. So these organisms that first were on land many of them were microscopic at that point. Of course, as time progressed, they became more multicellular, and the fungi were the ones that really jumped in there and helped the plants out. And this picture just blows my mind. Those tall stalks you see on the left, that's a fungus. That is an early fungus that formed back when the earth was forming itself. That's about 400 million years ago, before trees were common on earth. We had giant mushrooms, 24 feet tall, 3 feet wide, that were known as prototaxites. And essentially, you can see some of the fossil remains there in the bottom left, some portions of it, but that's a recreation of what it probably looked like in the top right with the actual mushrooms themselves. So the fungi were some of the earliest organisms to populate the planet, and they did pretty well. Now, fungi are so successful because of their diverse metabolic activities. When you talk about metabolism, you're talking about chemical transformation. When we take in food, we metabolize it, we break it down, we use the component parts that we can use, and we get rid of the rest. And that's essentially what these organisms are doing here as well. The fungi can explore, scavenge, and salvage very diverse substances by using cocktails of potent enzymes and acids. 60% of the enzymes used in industry are generated by fungi. And 15% of vaccines are produced by engineered strains of yeast. Many of our medicinal drugs come from fungi. Things like penicillin, cyclosporin, the statins, Taxol, alcohol, psilocybin, that's for you, David. And of course, as you know, that psilocybin comes from the psychedelic mushrooms. Now, there are many diseases that are caused by fungi. Also, they're not all good. Some of them do cause diseases that cause billions of dollars of losses each year. These include what is known as a red blast fungus that destroys enough rice to feed 60 million people a year. The fungal diseases of trees, Dutch elm disease, and chestnut blight. Our agricultural practices reduce a plant's interaction with the fungi. We go in and manipulate the soil, manipulate the area where we're putting these plants. And as a result, we have to use a lot of antifungal chemicals that cause superbugs to form, which is why we need stronger and stronger pesticides. Bananas are being decimated by fungal diseases. I hate to tell you, but bananas are predicted to become extinct within the next few decades. So eat your bananas now. Eat lots of bananas. Amphibians are now being threatened by extinction. So far, they've lost at least 90 species due to fungal infections. And this is just to illustrate a few of those diseases. The Dutch elm disease is at the top left in terms of what it's doing to that tree. The rice disease is on the right. And of course, the bananas are easily recognizable. And of course, the cute little golden toads on the right. So that's a lot about fungi. Let's go back to the trees here for a moment. You all know what a tree looks like. In the bottom left, you see a typical tree with the crown at the top that contains the branches and leaves, the trunk, and then the extensive root system that is underground. On the right are just some of the common trees that we have in the US. The red maple there on the left, the sugar maple, the dogwood that you'll see lining the street out front here in just a few months that are just beautiful this time of year or soon to be. And on the right, you see what is known as a Douglas fir. I had to include this slide because of personal reasons. In my side yard is a Douglas fir that is now 80 feet tall. It is a state record. It was planted by my grandmother when the house was built in 1914 as a seed from a catalog. And it has grown to 80 feet at this point. I thought the tree might be getting old, but there are records of Douglas firs that can live hundreds, if not thousands of years. So hopefully my tree will be there long after I'm gone. So some of these trees are incredible in terms of the longevity that they do have and what they can withstand. Now, this is a tree that is not native to this part of the country. This is typically a Western species, so that may cut down on its longevity to a certain degree. So a tree, it's a woody plant with a trunk that has branches. That's how we think of a tree. We never think of the most important part of the tree, which is the root system. This is the root system. It is the root system that helps the tree survive, helps it withstand climate change. It can regrow damaged trunks. It can manage the chemical activity in the tree and act as the tree equivalent of the brain. The tree equivalent of the brain. Now, I'll be coming back to that reference in a bit. Some biologists have questioned that plants have brains, but at the end of the talk, you can tell me what you think. At the end of the 4 weeks, you can tell me what you think. So if a growing tree encounters toxic substances or large boulders or saturated soil that's too wet, it can transmit adjustments to the growing root tip, and that will change the direction of growth. This is information that is transmitted through that root system. It's a physical network that forms an advancing front composed of innumerable tiny command centers, each of which gathers information about the root development and determines the direction of growth. The entire root system guides the plant like a collective brain. It also collects information essential to the nutrition and survival of the plant. What do I mean by a collective brain? It's easier to explore an unknown environment using a decentralized system like plant roots with many small agents probing the soil rather than a centralized system with one command center. A number of organisms use collective investigation of unknown spaces, like swarms of insects or flocks of birds that can act almost as a single organism in gathering information. And I had to throw in the heart over there of the birds just to wish you happy Valentine's Day. Now, for many years, these collective groups were thought to be found only in animals. But any group of single agents that make autonomous decisions, lacks a centralized organization, uses simple rules to communicate, and acts collectively as a community. Plants can be thought of as having modular parts like a colony of insects has modular parts. Erasmus Darwin, this is Charles' father, in the 18th century said that we should see trees as colonies of modules that repeat themselves. Plants are organisms that are able to use resources that come from interactions between groups and adopt complex solutions, kind of like we do. Decentralization is something that we tend to see in plants. Animals do tend to concentrate. We have a centralized system that involves our brain that regulates our bodily functions, whether it's hearing, eyesight, heart, breathing, digestion. We have a central command center that is our brain. Plants, on the other hand, have decentralized so they can spread each function over the entire organism, over the entire organisms. They breathe with their whole bodies. They see with their whole bodies. And yes, some do have visual components that we'll see later. They feel with their whole bodies, and they evaluate with their whole bodies. By doing this, they can survive predation and even portions of their bodies being removed without losing functionality. That is something that we certainly could not do. So, is there plant intelligence? Even though these plants do not have a central brain, they exhibit unmistakable attributes of intelligence. They're able to perceive their surroundings with greater sensitivity than animals do. They actively compete for limited resources in the soil and atmosphere. They evaluate their circumstances with precision. They define and take appropriate adaptive actions in response to environmental stimuli. They embody a model that is more durable and innovative than that of animals. They are representatives of how stability and flexibility can be combined. When it comes to robustness and innovation, nothing can compete with plants. Trying to make you feel a little humble here. And also just appreciate how much the entire planet is dependent upon all organisms that are here. We are dependent on the plants are dependent on us and dependent on the fungi. It is a network. It is a social network that basically keeps it going. So how do these roots communicate? When we think of plants, we don't think of them as communicating with each other in the same ways that we do. Do they use chemicals, smell, taste, electrical impulses, movement? And if so, how do they interpret these messages? We're recently learning that most plants can use all of the above to communicate. We'll be talking about some of those this week and next week. But first, let's look at the hyphy of that fungus, those small branches that are coming out of the fungus, and how it forms this mycelial network with the tree roots. They accomplish this in two ways. They branch and they fuse in a process known as anastomosis, where they basically join together. Now, the hyphae have to be able to find each other to form this mycelium, which is the basis for networking. They must fuse with other hyphae that are sexually compatible. Yes, there are sexes of these fungi, and pool their genetic material. They're believed to use pheromones to attract mates. Sound familiar? They also must find a compatible tree, since plants must admit the fungi to their roots to form a mutually beneficial relationship and not one that might cause disease or kill the plant. Both plant and fungus use volatile chemicals to make themselves attractive to each other, kind of like cologne. So what am I talking about here when I'm talking about the hyphae and the mycelium? If you look, let's start with the top right. That sort of breaks it down into the root system or the mycelium of the fungus that you see there, the one that spreads all underground, and the fruiting body, which we think of as the cap of the mushroom. But on the left, bottom left, you can see again, if we start with the actual mushroom itself, you see that spores are released. That's why it's called the fruiting body. Those spores that are released are plus or minus, or you could think of them as male or female, or if you want to stay with plus or minus, that's fine too. Where the hyphae, those are the hyphae that come together, and once they find the appropriate compatible hypha, they will then fuse to form this mycelium, which becomes this extensive root system. Now, the bottom right picture is the one that kind of blows my mind. This is looking at the hyphae in a little more detail. And I want you to notice some of the components here that we talked about in animal cells last week. First of all, a cell wall, typical that you find in plants. A Golgi apparatus, remember that is in our animal cells and is used to basically gather in the DNA products that are produced, the proteins that are produced, and are sent out to the rest of the body. There are plasma membranes. There are lipid bodies. Look at the mitochondria. The mitochondria that produce the ATP, the energy that is necessary to drive these processes. And the nuclei that are present in each component of this fungus. Notice the tips of this hypha. That's the sensitive growing tip of the fungus that senses its environment to the point of telling it to avoid that boulder that's in front of it, or to not go that direction, it's too wet. And it basically does a course correction. So these are components in this fungus that we also find in animal cells. So when we talk in evolution about common ancestry, we're looking at shared structures that have benefited organisms for millions of years and enable them to progress even further. Some of these root systems, and I'm sure you've seen trees like this in the forest, are actually, some of them are on top of the ground. That's for the trees. The fungi are typically underground. But you can see how extensive these systems can become. So do plants communicate? That's what we're going to be looking at. How do we explain the interactions of non-human organisms? We think of them as showing inanimate behavior, like robots, rather than the rich human experiences that we have. Are they just showing automatic responses to a series of biochemical triggers? And that may be your conclusion when this series is over. The hyphae that you just saw in the previous picture are chemically irritable. That is, they respond to other chemicals. They are responsive and they are excitable. They can interpret chemical emissions of others that allows the relationship to form with trees. They can receive nutrients from the soil. They can reproduce sexually. They can hunt. They can fend off attackers. Obviously, fungi can actively sense and interpret their worlds in ways we cannot yet understand. The chemical language either passes over our heads or under our feet, if you're a fungus. Bad when you have to explain them. Okay, now let's look first at smell or olfaction. Humans, this is one way in which the plants communicate. Humans that have a reasonably good sense of smell, not as good as that of your dog, but it's still pretty good. And we can detect a wide variety of substances. Our sense of smell helps us detect fear, anxiety, aggression, even our choice of sexual partners. Did you know that the pheromones that you emit when you first meet somebody have more influence than just looking at the color of his or her eyes? Those pheromones, those chemicals that you are releasing, basically help attract mates, even in humans, even in humans. This ability to detect and respond to chemicals is a primordial sensory ability that most organisms use to explore their environment. Plants, animals, and fungi all use similar types of receptors to trigger chemical changes. The molecules must land on their olfactory epithelium and bind to a receptor. Fungi don't have a nose, but instead their entire body surface contains olfactory sensors and receptors where these molecules bind to alter the behavior of the plant. Now, in a human, you can see that the airborne odors enter the nasal cavity. They go to the upper region of the nasal cavity that you see there, and they go to what is called the olfactory epithelium. That is the structure where the receptors are located. The odor molecules bind to that epithelium. They trigger a response in the olfactory nerves, which is then sent to the olfactory cortex of the brain, where it is then interpreted. Now, fungi don't have noses or brains. So instead, their entire surface consists of olfactory epithelium that is sensitive to chemicals. One molecule that binds to its surface can trigger a signaling cascade that alters fungal behavior. Truffles, one of the fungi I'm going to be talking a little bit about here, use chemicals to communicate to animals that they are ready to be eaten and have their spores unearthed and dispersed. Now, why would they want to do that? That's because truffles grow underground so that their spores cannot be caught by air currents, and they are invisible to the eyes of animals. Their solution is to bring their spores to the surface, and they use smell for that. They produce an odor that has to outcompete the multiple smells that are already present in the forest, and it must penetrate the soil. It must get out of the soil to get the attention of animals who are above ground, who will seek it out, dig it up, and eat it. Eat it. Because the animal then carries the spores off to a new place where they can germinate. This is an example of hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary entanglement with animal tastes. With animal tastes. It has to be something the animal will consume to have it then dug up and eaten. Now, dogs are one of the common hunters for truffles. In fact, they are highly prized in some parts of this country, certainly in Europe, where truffles are common, but they're, as I said, they are underground and we can't smell them, but dogs can. And as a result, these dogs are specially trained to seek out particular truffles. There are different kinds. There's some white ones and some black ones. And I'll show you some of the differences here shortly. But these dogs, as I said, are highly prized. There are some individuals who will actually go into an area and lay down poison to kill another person's dog so that they have access to the truffle grounds. The truffles are so valuable. They sell for so much money, and they're so hard to come by that people that own property where truffles are found are very possessive of these truffles. And as a result, they want complete access to them. And so they'll go in, they'll shoot somebody else's dog, they'll do whatever they have to do in order to protect them. They're that valuable in some parts of the world. So as I said, some of the truffles are black, Some of them are white. Some of them are different types that are not as valuable. It varies with the type of truffle that we're talking about here. And yes, that is a pig to the left there that is also a good truffle hunter. And we'll look at why here in just a moment. Some fungi are poisonous, but most are edible. And the most expensive ones are the truffles. These are highly prized by chefs. There's about 1,000 species of truffles in North America, and only a handful are of culinary interest. The truffle produces an aroma that forms from its relationship with its community of microbes, yeasts, soil, and the climate where it lives. Both black and white truffles produce androstenol, which is a steroid with a musky scent. In pigs, it is a sex hormone produced by the males, which explains why they avidly dig those mushrooms. So this is why pigs are also commonly used to find the mushrooms, because they smell this particular hormone that is underground. And so they will dig it up. Now, most of the time they have to put a mask on the pig so that the pig doesn't consume the truffle once it has been found. The aromas that are made by living metabolizing cells and the odors increase as the spores develop, but they stop when the cells die. So that makes the aromas attractive to animals in the forest. They make plant roots that produce odors that drift through the soil and cause spores to sprout. And the flavor of the truffles is only optimal within 48 hours of collecting them, which means that these folks that are collecting truffles and selling them for a living have to get to the forest, bring their pig or their dogs, get the truffles, get them back to a station where they are cleaned, packaged, put on an airplane, shipped to New York or whichever city they're going to. They have to be picked up there, brought to the restaurant, and again, eaten within 48 hours in order to have the maximum flavor that they would have. All right, I'm going to stop there for questions today. And as I said, we've just been talking about smell pretty much so far in terms of one of the ways in which plants communicate. So we'll be talking about other ways next week and probably the following week. Do you have questions? David, can you unmute?
I think folks are going to have to unmute themselves. I can ask them to unmute, but
Okay.
right.
All right, questions?
It was wonderful. I
Thank
can't think
you.
of questions though.
Thank you, Suzanne. Rebecca, you had a question?
I was trying to imagine how they knew the mushrooms were that tall. That's all organic matter, and you had some sort of.
I'm assuming that
Julie,
they do this
wait,
through
Julie,
fossil.
nobody could hear what Rebecca outside could hear what Rebecca said. Could you?
I'm sorry.
repeat?
I'm sorry. I'm still getting used to this system.
That's
Yes,
all
Rebecca asked how they knew that the early fungi were as tall as they were, since that is organic matter that probably should not fossilize. That is something I have to ask a paleontologist in terms of how they determine that. I don't know if that has left marks on rocks or whatever that perhaps they have found. That I do not know. Good question. I wondered the same thing.
Are there truffles around here?
There are truffles. I know there are truffles in the Northwest. My neighbor claims, I don't believe him, but my neighbor claims that he found some truffles growing in my backyard about 20 years ago. He went down and immediately cleaned them out. I think he just found mushrooms, but regular mushrooms, but he claims they were truffles. So truffles cannot usually be grown, I shouldn't say in captivity, but they can't be cultivated like many of the mushrooms can. They're better when they are in that soil, and they pick up the aromas and the flavors that come with that soil. And that's why the truffle itself is so highly prized, because it is a product of the soil of the forest in which it grows.
I've never had truffles. Has anybody else had them?
If you had had them, you would know it because they're very expensive.
I haven't had them.
Real musky flavor. I don't like it.
Okay, Joan says that they have a very musky flavor and she didn't like them. Well, the musky flavor comes from that androstenedione, which is basically a sex hormone.
So Julie, if we.
I know there are truffles in the mountains because we live in Bakersfield, and a number of people that made their living had truffle dogs and worked the mountains.
Okay, all right,
Bakersfield's on the other side of Rome, so it's close by.
right. Okay, thank you, Rob, good to know. Rebecca, you had a question?
If we put a shovel in the ground, could we see mycelium?
She says, if we put a shovel in the ground, could we see mycelium? Probably so. They're going to be quite small. They will almost look hair-like whenever you would see them. But those of you that have gardened, and I'm sure a lot of folks in here have, or planted flowers, you know you dig down so far and you start running into some interesting things in the ground. I'm not sure how far you would have to go around here to get to those. Richard.
You can find a rotted log laying on the forest floor.
Mhm.
If it's damp area,
Mhm.
you just roll it over and you can see the mycelium
Okay.
coming out the ground.
Richard says next time you're in the woods and you find a rotted log, just roll it over and you'll see the mycelia under that log.
I thought I might point out that there are a lot of plants that can't be transplanted because the fungus it doesn't transplant with them necessarily, including the common pink lady slipper around here. And a lot of people have tried to transplant those and they can't survive, transplanted.
Yeah, that's where that compatible nature comes in. There has to be a certain chemistry, so to speak, between the plant and the fungus in order for those two to merge together. Because remember, they are fusing the root system and the hyphae together in this arrangement that they have. And it is something that is going to persist most of the time for the life of the organisms. And so they want to be sure that they have the right partner, so to speak.
Julie,
Yes.
when I take a pitchfork to my compost bin and turn it over, I find a lot of little white, like root type things. Is that mycelium?
That should be mycelium. So talk to them next time. Don't hurt them. Just talk to them.
Muted.
What happens if you break them open, if you turn them apart?
Then what happens is, remember, this is a collective brain that they have, not a non-collective brain. This means that you could break them up, they will come back because the hyphae, the question was, what happens if you break them apart? Those hyphae will regrow and come back. So you're not really killing the fungus. Think of it, the same thing that happens when there are forest fires and you see this whole area decimated, the plant life. But what starts to come back within a very short time are the small roots of the plants. And that's because it is this decentralized system that they have where you can kill off a portion of it, but then it will come back and regrow in that area. And as we'll get to a little bit later, some of these relationships, especially between a parent tree and their children, the smaller trees beneath them, the way they feed each other is just, okay, we'll get to that. I had to throw that out there just to bring you back next week.
When did they start really realizing the value of the mycelium? I mean, I don't really remember hearing about this just in the last 5 years, but has this been known for the last 20, 30, 40 years?
This is something that Darwin and his father both discussed and actually have, I think there's a book written that he gets into some of this type of communication with the mycelium. I have not read that particular book, but he does mention it. So it's been out there, but in terms of finding ways in which these organisms can communicate, that has been relatively recent. I would say that was within the last 15 to 25 years that they've really gotten into measuring it, because, you know, how do you measure an electrical potential in a root system? We simply didn't have the technology to do that until recent years. We now have the computers that can get into these systems and do a certain amount of measuring and record it that, again, we didn't have until recent years. So this whole, I was going to say this whole body of knowledge is going to mushroom. It's going to spread incredibly in the years to come as we perfect a lot of these techniques and are able to learn more and more about just what is going on in these plants and in the root systems around us.
Julie,
Yes.
I would highly recommend a book called Finding the Mother Tree.
Mhm.
Stan Simard, Simard, and it discusses the intricacies of the old growth trees and what the under the ground network, how it's working, and the importance of logging. And because when you take one part of the forest floor, you know, say a tree out or 10 trees out, then you're disrupting the whole communication within that certain number of square miles. And, you know, it's detrimental to the community just by destroying a part of it. But it's Finding the Mother Tree. You can also find interviews with Suzanne on YouTube, which, you know, just type in her name and Finding the Mother Tree. And it is fascinating, a fascinating read, and, you know, whatever you can find online.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a couple of references that I'm going to put up next week that also support most of what I'm saying here. But there's one especially that has to do with the fungi. It's entanglement, something entanglement. It's been on the bestseller list now for months and months. And it is a wonderful read because it goes into a lot of these details of what these fungi are doing and how they're interacting. And of course, the hidden life of trees is a big one. Brian's going to be talking about that one in the sermon today. And then there's another one that has to do with communication, plant communication. So there are a number of books that are starting to come out about all of this, which tells you that this is right now a very interesting aspect of research that's going on.
Yeah, and following up on Aubrey, one of the things Suzanne did was to do experiments where she radioactively tagged carbon from two different trees so that she could demonstrate that the carbon from one tree went to another one. And she's probably the first or close to the first one that ever did that, and got years of grief about it because it flew in the face of British Columbia's policy of planting monocultures with trees and clear cutting everything else but the tree that they wanted to grow.
Mhm. Yeah.
Julie,
Yes.
I've always loved that poem. I think I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree.
Mhm.
And I remember one time we had a church retreat over, seems like it was Irwin in the woods over there. And we all went off together and did tree hugging. We connected with a tree there in the forest. And we have in our yard here a grouping of sassafras that they're leaned back from each other. And it looks like they would be in a dance. So it seems like it's a spiritual place and feeling when you see it, when you're near it. And really, it just looks like a dance of that community of sassafras trees.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. The main trees that I remember hugging were the giant redwoods and the sequoias out west. When I saw those magnificent trees, I just stood there and cried and hugged. I mean, it was phenomenal. Some of these trees had been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and we're still growing strong, thanks to those fungi under them that have kept feeding them and kept them going. So it's an amazing world.
It is. Thank you so much.
We
Yeah.
have another question.
Mary has a question.
Okay, I've got a question here, just a moment, then I'll get to you. Yes, Bobby.
Not so much a question, but I worked for a person years ago that was growing fungus on a petri dish. And under the microscope, it looked like blood vessels. And you could see the transports going on in between. It was like, I could have easily been looking at blood cells going through capillaries.
I don't know if you could hear that, but Bobby was talking about seeing some fungus in a petri dish under a microscope, and that you could actually see the flow of fluids going through that fungus under the microscope, that she said reminded her of seeing blood going through a blood vessel. Okay, somebody else had a question?
I did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to recommend another book that Jean has read and really liked, called The Songs of Trees by David George Haskell.
He teaches at Swanee.
He teaches at Swanee.
Okay.
Julie, I have a question. Have you read anything about plants and trees communicating with humans? The mice where I work communicated with plants through vibrations. They could hear the vibrations of the plants. They could feel the vibrations with their hand.
With humans, I have not come across that yet. Most of what I have read has been plant to plant or plant to fungus. But I will keep an eye out for that.
I think you'd find
certainly the chemicals that they produce, the plants produce, that communicates to humans, not only through truffles, but through, think of colognes that are based on a lot of fungal materials. That communicates again to humans chemically, in terms of the way that we view them.
I had a question about early on, the comment was made that fungus depend on each other and on humans. I mean, the interaction of what do the plants need from humans?
Not to cut the trees down.
Well, that's obvious.
Plant a tree, maintain those trees as best you can, because the trees are basically what help to keep the system going underground, and vice versa.
Okay.
And a yeast is considered a fungus, yes. Yes. Yes, we have yeast, we have fungi, we have bacteria. We are an ecosystem of all kinds of organisms that are normal, that are supposed to be there. I knew someone once that went home and tried to wash his eyes out because he felt that, they were there were bacteria there. And I said, they're supposed to be there. Leave them alone. Any other? Yes.
I have another recommendation. It's a wonderful, beautiful documentary film called Fantastic Fungi.
Yes.
And we saw it about 3 years ago, I guess, at the Asheville Fine Arts Theater, but you can now see it on Netflix and YouTube and Amazon Prime. So it is just gorgeous cinematography, but just great information too.
Thank you, Nancy. I was going to mention that at some point. I will now assign that as homework for next week. So everybody should check on Netflix and watch the documentary Fantastic Fungi. All right. I think we're going to shut down here since we're getting ready for church. Thank you folks so much for your time and attention. I appreciate your.
Thank you.
Yeah, great job.
Yay, Julie.
Good job. Thank you, Julie.
you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Brian.
Okay.